Welcome to the full Dungeons & Dragons Iceberg Explained video. It's a long one, so I'll get started right away, though please do subscribe. The sky. Most of this layer will come as no surprise to you if you're watching this video. It requires very little specialist knowledge and is largely made up of pop culture references. I'll try to explore these topics beyond face value though. DM. Starting off with the most important person at the table, many people will already be aware of the concept of a DM or Dungeon Master. The Dungeon Master is the person responsible for planning, organising and controlling encounters, adventures and campaigns for players. D&D is not a linear game and is often thought of as a system to allow players to experience, influence and create their own stories within a game world with set rules to act as a guide. DMs are both the interpreter and arbiter of the rules, being the final decision maker on all rulings, and are responsible for creating and maintaining a consistent game world. DMs provide descriptions to characters throughout their journeys on what they're experiencing at given moments. The role is complex, as they must have a deep awareness of both game mechanics and lore, and walk the delicate lines between balance, storytelling, and allowing creativity from players. It really is an art form when done right, and you should all remember to show your DM's appreciation, if you have one. Stranger Things. Stranger Things is a sci-fi horror series set in the 80s. Appropriate adjectives might include stylish, thrilling, tense, and touching. The plot surrounds a group of friends growing up in small-town America, facing creepy, paranormal, and just, generally, strange things. The boys have the quintessential nerdy qualities we've come to expect from underdogs in television, and true to form, and the reason Stranger Things is in this video, they play a certain role-playing game. The representation of D&D in Stranger Things plays a bit fast and loose with rules, sometimes forgetting who should be rolling when, but it certainly captures the feel of the game. The group, arguing over what they should do next for far too long, borderline metagaming, until the DM's finally had enough and makes them decide right then. And the mum, coming in to interrupt the session, was a familiar occurrence in our group well into our 20s. The hardest part in the latter series is watching Will want to play D&D when his friends just aren't interested anymore. We've all experienced the death throes of a group tapering out. I should be clear though, the relevance of D&D in Stranger Things goes beyond a game we watch the characters play. It's used for story exposition, and there are even parallels between the games they play and eventual plot points. To give a few examples, the Upside Down is explained in reference to the Veil of Shadows, Mind Flayers are used to explain a creature in the second season, and Will's death and theft by both the fake and real Demogorgon feel like a clear example of foreshadowing. Speaking of foreshadowing, Stranger Things isn't the only series to reference D&D. Community. Before Rick and Morty, Dan Harmon's breakthrough hit was Community, a charming sitcom filled to the brim with pop culture references, misadventures, and as you can probably guess, a D&D episode or two. The first episode showed a depressed character called Fat Neil being made fun of. Neil loves D&D, so Jeff, for what we later find out is from the guilt of coining Neil's nickname, pretends to be interested in D&D and organises the game with Abed as DM. Pierce, being insensitive and tactless, isn't invited. However, he comes along anyway and predictably ends up causing trouble. Mechanics are again not followed to the T in the episode. Characters are pre-rolled by the DM, though that isn't totally uncommon for one-shots, and the DM seems to do some roles that the player would usually do. For example, initiative, though again, this might be to simplify the game for beginners. What is lost likely wouldn't have made for good TV, and I think they generally do a good job of encapsulating the spirit of D&D. The group are told they're supposed to be defeating a dragon, however PC goes rogue, and the group create their own story trying to bring him down, ignoring whatever the DM had planned. And what could be more D&D than that? The episode is called Advanced Dungeons & Dragons, and the observant might correctly deduce that it is based on the second edition of D&D. An interesting juxtaposition to the Stranger Things entry is that where Stranger Things used D&D to foreshadow plot points of the series, in Community, Pierce brings real life into the game when through magic he transforms Fat Neil's PC from slim to fat, making fiction match fact. The second D&D episode again uses the game as a medium of storytelling, rather than purely as a narrative device or point of intrigue, as in some other media references. During the episode, Dan Harmon speaks to the viewer through Abed and expresses his own apprehension with doing a D&D episode sequel. However, he eventually takes the chance to prove he can do so satisfyingly. Meta. In the sequel, Advanced Dungeons & Dragons, the group organised a D&D session between a father and son with a fraught relationship to reunite them on a campaign to take down an evil necromancer. Though predictably, the D&D loving son is not so easily convinced to make up with his father, and uses his own player's prerogative to resist the attempts. The episode is epic, and as a bit of fan service we do get to glimpse fabulous Neil still doing the rounds on campus. Oh, and the first D&D episode was pulled from Netflix because of the presence of blackface. E.T. This is the last reference to films or series in this section of the Iceberg. The film needs no introduction, but to give a brief and inadequate one, Elliot, the protagonist, discovers a stranded alien, E.T., and the film follows Elliot and E.T.'s attempts to help E.T. find his way home. In the movie, no reference is made to Dungeons & Dragons, due to licensing issues. So, to protect Spielberg, for the rest of this entry, we'll be talking about T&T, which has absolutely no similarity to D&D. Spielberg used T&T before filming as a way of encouraging the cast and crew to feel like they were a family. One session even took place at Harrison Ford's house. We've seen historically the damage Hollywood can impart on young actors when they are not treated well, so Spielberg was doing it right. Thankfully, gone are the days of flagrantly feeding pet pills to young actors, creating tragic figures like Judy Garland, though I'd be remiss to suggest there is not still rampant exploitation. Anyway, the game of T&T is seen towards the beginning of the movie, and whilst it lacks the immersive storytelling we all feel when we play, I suspect it is an accurate reflection of how we sometimes look. Shouting random item and spell names at one another in a dimly lit room. There is a familiarity to the structure of the game, though the lack of precision and detail is apparently intentional, specifically to avoid the aforementioned licensing issues. According to Robert McNaughton, the actor who played Elliot's brother Michael, the final scene of E.T. was originally scripted to show Elliot acting as DM in a game with his brother and his friends, showing that he had been accepted by them, and eventually the camera would pan out to show that Elliot was also still in contact with E.T. via communicator. Whilst it sounds like a tidy, happy, slightly cheesy ending, the one we got was definitely better and is what makes the movie such a classic. Stephen Colbert. Known for The Late Show and The Colbert Report, Stephen Colbert is a popular TV host, commentator, and comedian. From a young age, he reportedly enjoyed sci-fi and fantasy novels, and in his teens, immersed himself in RPGs, especially D&D. Through the years, Colbert has made numerous references to his love of fantasy, heroically showing an impressive knowledge of the Tolkien mythos when questioned. Though he had not played D&D since college, that is, until 2019. For Red Nose Day 2019, Matthew Mercer of Critical Role ran a one-on-one-shot D&D campaign for Stephen Colbert, accepting donations from fans to influence the story and raise well over $50,000. You can watch the video using the link in the description below. Vin Diesel. If you only know Vin Diesel from the Fast and Furious or XXX series, you might assume he's just a meathead bro, and whilst he most likely is a meathead bro, he's also a massive nerd. He's been in quite a few sci-fis and comic book films, and seems genuinely passionate about them in interviews. From what I remember, he's pretty good in Pitch Black, even if the Riddick series eventually drops in quality. Though I should qualify with a note that I was 8 or 9 when I watched it, so I wasn't the most discerning moviegoer. He also plays Groot in Guardians of the Galaxy, though that could equally be for passion or dinero on the Marvel gravy train. What we do know is that Vin Diesel's deepest nerd passion was, and is, with D&D, and it's been reported that he often gets castmates to play with him, including Dame Judi Dench. If you want to see him play, he sat down with Nerdist and Geek and Sundry to play a game, which you can watch in the link in the description below. Many Dice. I'm 99% sure this is referring to the many dice that are used in D&D. However, I was too embarrassed to ask M. Christopher about an entry in the Sky level, so I thought I'd save my questions for the more obscure entries later. If I have missed something here, it's totally my bad. I should emphasise that M. Christopher has not set me an arbitrary limit on the number of questions I can ask. Only my own sense of shame has set that. In D&D, players usually require a D4, D6, D8, D10, D12 and D20 dice at a minimum, though most sets also include an additional D10 marked in the tens so percentages can be rolled, effectively making the two D10s a D100 when used together. As anyone who's played D&D knows, lots of rolls use the iconic D20, so a popular addition is simply an extra D20. This, for example, can be useful when players roll with advantage or disadvantage. Initially, D&D did not use the current D10 dice shape, the pentagonal trapezahedron, and instead used a D20 where the numbers 0 to 9 each appeared on two faces. This is because the dice sets were originally made and sold by an educational company and only adapted by TSR for the purposes of D&D. The D4, D6, D8, D12 and D20 shapes are the platonic solids. The 5 platonic solids are the only regular polyhedrons, which is the reason they were sold as an educational product. Yes, that does mean that not only were D10s a later addition to D&D, but they are also the only non-platonic die. Apologies to those that will now leave this video with an irrational hatred of D10s. Satanic Panic. As we all know, D&D is a gateway drug into the Church of Satan, and we each learnt our pagan ways through the rituals and ceremonies depicted in the player's handbook. In all seriousness, whilst it might sound silly now, there really was a moral panic surrounding D&D in the 80s, particularly amongst Christian groups in the US, claiming that D&D was promoting Satanism to young people. It was said that D&D encouraged everything from devil worship and suicide to homosexuality, prostitution, and even cannibalism. These are of course completely unfounded claims, and whilst I won't rebut all of the accusations, the American Association of Suicidology, US Centre for Disease and Control, and Health and Welfare Canada all found no causal link between fantasy gaming and suicide. We'll see later that suicide in particular was the spark of the moral panic, which makes it such a pertinent point to address. Whilst our in-game characters may have committed crimes against humanity, the average player is only guilty of crimes against our DM's patience. Tip of the iceberg. We've finished looking at the first layer and now get to go a bit deeper. Here, we start to see subjects which only those who have at least a passing interest in D&D will have heard of. Satanic Panic, again. Satanic Panic appears on the iceberg image twice. It might just be a typo, however I'm choosing to interpret the entries as two different levels of the same topic. So here, I'll dig a bit deeper into what we discussed above and give a couple of examples. In 1979, just before the turn of the 80s, James Darlus Egbert III went missing from his university dorm, and it was suggested that D&D was the cause. Egbert was actually hiding in the utility tunnels at his university, possibly intending to commit suicide, and suffered from drug addiction and depression. Sadly, Egbert later successfully committed suicide by gunshot in 1980, which was also blamed on D&D. In 1981, a novel was written called Mazes and Monsters dramatising the events, leaning heavily into the interpretation that he entered the tunnels to live-action roleplay, or LARP, D&D. To reiterate though, it is believed his actual reason for entering the tunnels was a suicide attempt. In 1982, Irving Lee Pulling, who himself played D&D, committed suicide by gunshot wound. His mother, Patricia Pulling, believed that Irving committed suicide because of D&D. She described the game as a fantasy role-playing game which uses demonology, witchcraft, voodoo, murder, rape, blasphemy, suicide, assassination, insanity, sex perversion, homosexuality, prostitution, satanic-type rituals, gambling, barbarism, cannibalism, sadism, desecration, demon summoning, necromantics, divination, and other teachings. she unsuccessfully filed a wrongful death lawsuit against her son's high school principal, holding him responsible for her son's death because of a curse he allegedly placed on Irving's in-game character in a D&D game he ran. She later founded Bothered About Dungeons & Dragons, or BADD, BAD, in 1983 to launch a media campaign against D&D, especially in religious news media, though also in mainstream media outlets, leading to strong beliefs in the Christian community that the game was satanic and occult. While Patricia was a grieving mother and we should have sympathy for the tragedy she endured, the organisation misled millions of people and was selective and deceptive in its presentation of information, which fanned the flames of the moral panic. We should apply Hanlon's razor though, and not apply to malice what is adequately explained by stupidity. Patricia once told a news reporter that she estimated 8% of people in Richmond, Virginia to be Satanists, which she came to by adding her estimated figures of 4% of adults and 4% of teenagers together. Critical Role. Critical Role is an enormously popular online web series following the D&D campaigns of a group of voice actors. I think their popularity stems from the professional standard of their voice acting and their commitment to involving and engaging with their audience. They're currently in the depths of their third campaign. Their first campaign ran for 3 years offline before they started streaming, so the group are genuine D&D enthusiasts, which certainly adds to the authenticity of what we see. Even if Critical Role has become a brand at this point, they are still largely beloved by the Dungeons & Dragons community because it's clear they're passionate about D&D. Besides the 3 major campaigns, they've also run plenty of one-shots. We've already mentioned one, being the session Matthew Mercer ran with Stephen Colbert. Miniatures. Whilst not strictly necessary, miniatures are often used in D&D to represent player characters on grids, to allow players to better visualise combat and judge distances between characters and objects. Different editions have placed more or less emphasis on miniatures, however tokens can be used in place of miniatures in all versions. The first edition of D&D in 1974 referred to the use of miniatures, though only as aesthetically pleasing to use. However, at that time players primarily played without them, as representative models were not as easily accessible in those years, especially for the stranger D&D creatures. Imagine the difficulty of finding a miniature of a brain with legs between 25 and 28mm in size in 1974. Miniatures were more common from the second edition onwards, when a more complex grid-based system was developed, meaning the use of miniatures or tokens were now necessary mechanically. The first line of official D&D miniatures were produced by Minifigs in 1977, and throughout D&D's history, the official license has been handed to a multitude of companies. From 2003 to 2011, Wizards of the Coast produced an official line for the Dungeons & Dragons miniature game, though after the game's cancellation in 2011, the right to produce official D&D miniatures was again licensed to other companies, and is currently held by WizKids. Miniatures are more necessary in other types of tabletop gaming, particularly wargaming. However, my only real experience with that was an unassembled box of Chaos Space Marines from my childhood. Though more recently I have played a few games of tabletop Blood Bowl 7s, which I very much enjoyed. Still, burning money is a cheaper hobby, so I won't push it. 5e. Originally referred to as D&D Next during development, 5e refers to the 5th and most recent edition of Dungeons & Dragons. Before its release, the most popular version in a survey of players would undoubtedly have been 3.5, and whilst 3.5 remains hugely popular among the player base, 5e has proven itself to be a worthy addition in its own right. It's distinguished from 3.5 by simpler mechanics, especially in the use of advantage and disadvantage rolls to reduce the number of modifiers that need to be kept track of, and it's therefore very accessible. 3.5 remains the choice for many players who want deeper customization options, though I should be clear that the mechanics of both games offer the tools for complex storytelling, and more complex math does not necessarily equate to greater role-playing options. Broad strokes. The Forgotten Realms. Forgotten Realms is the high fantasy campaign setting which is most often associated with Dungeons & Dragons. The planet the Forgotten Realms is set on is called Toril, with Faerun, being the continent where Forgotten Realms stories are predominantly set. Other settings exist on the planet Toril, some of which we will look at deeper into this iceberg. These settings are either supposed to be played independently of Forgotten Realms, or, in some cases, can act as add-ons. Forgotten Realms is the default setting for the 5th edition of D&D, and is the setting for a large amount of D&D media, including games like Neverwinter Nights and Baldur's Gate, and books like the Elminster series by Ed Greenwood. The last example is particularly relevant because Ed Greenwood is the creator of the Forgotten Realms setting. He had been developing the setting since he was a child, and later used the setting in his own games as a DM. From 1979, he began to publish stories based in the setting in the Dragon magazine, though this and later content was reportedly less dark than his own campaigns as a DM. In 1986, TSR, the original publishers of D&D and the Dragon magazine, approached Greenwood and asked him to prepare official Forgotten Realms material for a new official Advanced Dungeons & Dragons setting, which he enthusiastically agreed to. Greenwood has been involved in the production of Forgotten Realms material ever since, continuing to publish novels in the setting. This development of course follows some quite dramatic changes at TSR, though I'll elaborate on those later in the TSR section. For the purposes of this entry, the key information is that TSR were looking to move away from Gary Gygax's World of Greyhawk as the main setting for D&D. Gary Gygax. Along with Dave Arneson, Gary Gygax co-developed Dungeons & Dragons, completing the game in 1974. This was not Gary's first foray into game development, as he had developed a miniature-based game called Chainmail in 1971. Gary originally founded TSR with Don Kay in 1973, specifically to self-publish their products, as they reportedly had trouble finding publishers for D&D. That is a decision which has not aged at all well for those publishers. Later that year, Brian Bloom was brought in as an equal partner in TSR. Again, I'll save the machinations of TSR for the TSR entry later in the iceberg. Though it would make George R.R. Martin proud. Really juicy stuff. As you might expect, Gygax had an interest in gaming from a young age, particularly miniatures, wargaming, and LARPing. Gygax reportedly used to explore the tunnels below his hometown, which combined with his love for pulp horror and fantasy novels, explains both the dungeons and the dragons. Gygax himself also claimed that the reason he placed such an emphasis on chance in the game came from his role as an insurance underwriter, where he regularly saw normal people's plans scuppered by bad luck. So the stars truly aligned for the inspiration and creation of D&D. In his personal life, Gygax had 6 children and was married twice. One famous story is that his first wife, at one time during her second pregnancy, thought that Gygax was cheating on her because he was always busy and spent a lot of time away from her. However, upon trying to catch him in a compromising act in their basement, she instead found him role-playing with his friends. Some things never change. Gygax and his first wife were at one point Jehovah's Witnesses, though they eventually disassociated, likely due to the tension created from Gygax's smoking, drinking, and involvement with D&D at the height of the moral panic. On top of drinking, Gygax was a user of marijuana and later cocaine. It was during the time he was living in Hollywood, working on a licensed D&D cartoon, that his marriage broke down, which coincided with affairs, real ones this time. In his later life, after leaving TSR, Gygax continued to work on games, did some voice work, and even wrote a preface to the 1998 Return to the Tomb of Horrors adventure. Gygax unfortunately died in 2008, widowing his second wife Gail. Adventure League. The Adventurers League is the official Wizards of the Coast organised play programme for 5e, set in the Forgotten Realms. Organised play refers to a system whereby DMs run adventures which are distributed by Wizards of the Coast, usually in game shops, though possibly online or at home. It's a great way to get new players into D&D, and also a good way for experienced players to find new people to play with. As the adventures are official, they are often of a high quality. The information on characters is logged, so there is continuity for characters, and also comparable metrics between characters involved in the adventures, no matter where the game took place in the world. Practically, organised play is not just a way for Wizards of the Coast to engage with players, but also encourages engagement from gaming shops, who are offered discounts by increasing their Wizards Play Network level through reporting player engagement. The Adventurers League runs different story arcs every season, each based within the Forgotten Realms, as I already mentioned, and it's currently in its 11th season. Fundamental to video games. It can't be understated how fundamental D&D has been to a whole swathe of video game genres, mechanics, and settings. There is more than enough here to just talk about RPGs, however D&D's influence goes far beyond the genres you might expect. That said, I will start with RPGs. At the most basic level, many RPGs use D&D mechanics to resolve in-game actions, so behind the scenes, the skeleton code for some RPGs may just be D&D. An example of this would be Star Wars: Knights of the Old Republic, which uses an adapted version of the 3rd edition of D&D. Dungeon crawlers like Diablo also have strong roots in D&D, and whilst they have mechanically different combat systems, they adapt the levelling and loot systems of D&D and are influenced by the more general D&D style fantasy setting. Similar influences could be identified for both turn-based and real-time strategy games, which use similar principles. The former would likely draw more directly on D&D mechanically. We can take it a step further and look at shooters, taking Call of Duty as an example. At first glance, COD may seem to be completely independent of D&D and share little in common with the game. However, if you dig a bit deeper, the levelling systems, access to perks, loadouts, and class systems really are all just adaptations of D&D mechanics. The impact of D&D continues to this day. The concept of open world gaming was heavily influenced by D&D, and even now, technical limitations really are the only thing preventing game designers from allowing the same kind of freedom of action that D&D encourages. D&D movie. The less said here the better. The 2000 Dungeons & Dragons film was a terrible, generic fantasy with few redeeming qualities, as were its 2 unrequested sequels. There is a reboot in the works, which has faced multiple delays due to the pandemic, though I hope in 2022 we'll finally get the D&D movie that we all deserve. WOTC. Wizards of the Coast are the current holders of the D&D license and acquired it by purchasing TSR, the original publisher of D&D, in 1997. Though I should note that Wizards of the Coast are owned by Hasbro, so the rabbit hole goes deeper. Before D&D, Wizards of the Coast were responsible for creating and releasing the Magic the Gathering card game, and were also the initial publishers of the Pokemon trading card game in America. Wizards of the Coast designed and produced all versions of D&D from the 3rd edition onwards, and continued to support the D&D license actively with media and community engagement. We've already looked at the Adventurers League as an example of this, and have discussed movies in development, though I should also note that they do license the property for video games, such as the Baldur's Gate series and Neverwinter. Neverwinter is a city on the northwestern coast of Faerun, and is the setting for many adventures in the Forgotten Realms. It is the setting for the Neverwinter Nights series of video games, and more recently, and I think the specific topic of this entry, it is the setting for a free-to-play Forgotten Realms MMO RPG, itself called Neverwinter, developed by Cryptic Studios. On release, Neverwinter was well received as an MMO. In particular, it was praised for its satisfying controls and combat system. Throughout its lifespan though, as with many free-to-play games, it has taken on pay-to-win traits, and whether it now strictly fits the definition of a pay-to-win game or not, paying money has in-game benefits beyond aesthetics. Therefore, paying money in-game does give an objective advantage to players. Neverwinter is an MMORPG, so the gameplay and mechanics are not identical to D&D, and things like spell effects are not always true to their D&D counterparts. However, this is to be expected when adapting D&D for an MMO. One interesting choice was to refer to the unfolding world and its updates as modules in the same way as the Dungeons & Dragons tabletop. Changing MMO worlds through updates to allow developers to tell new stories is not unique in the MMORPG space, but it does help support the D&D vibe, and directly incorporate storylines from the tabletop modules. The general plot of Neverwinter begins with the Lich Queen Valindra, and though the heroes fight a variety of different foes on their journey, it does, of course, culminate in a confrontation with Valindra. I feel that is vague and obvious enough to not spoil anything, though I should be clear that lore-wise, Neverwinter follows and adapts modules, but offers very little in comparison to other forms of media. Later in the Iceberg, there will be spoiler warnings when I'm discussing lore in more depth. Dark Alliance. Another recent officially licensed D&D game is Dungeons & Dragons Dark Alliance, which released in 2021 and was developed by 2K Games. The game really is quite beautiful with stunning scenes and backdrops, and does pay a bit of fan service with the inclusion of Dris Duerdam as a playable character. However, it's fundamentally just a standard hack and slash game, lacking both depth and charm. It has absolutely nothing on the original Dark Alliance hack and slash games, which were objectively not as pretty, however they had a far more engaging narrative and were fundamentally more fun to play in terms of gameplay. Tiamat. It might seem quite late in the video to have our first dive into lore, however please bear in mind that your casual observer at the tip of the iceberg is unlikely to know much about D&D lore. With that said, Tiamat was based on the real mythology of Babylon and has appeared in other media, including one of my favourite games, Spelunky 2. Tiamat is iconic in D&D lore. She is a lesser deity and queen of the chromatic dragons, having head from each species of chromatic dragon, red, green, black, blue and white, and has all of their associated powers in addition to a few extras. She is trapped in the Nine Hells and makes regular attempts to break free. There is no definitive answer as to exactly why Tiamat is trapped in the Nine Hells, though some suggest she was locked away after slaying a giant deity, whilst others suggest she was sent there as a punishment for opposing the gods when they came to the material plane. Tiamat, at a certain point, infiltrated the Cult of Dragons and subsequently morphed their agenda to suit her goals through her agents. There is a dedicated church of Tiamat. Her church is an evil one, where clerics are tasked with increasing hordes of wealth and sabotaging other faiths. Tiamat is an evil dragon and is often in conflict with others, particularly with her brother, Bahamut, as well as members of the Enthuric pantheon. As with many dragons, Tiamat is vain and looks down on humanity and mortals in general. She believes dragons should have dominion over the realms and has sought to control the realms at different points in history. She has had 3 main avatars: the Dark Lady, a woman with long dark hair and black eyes, the Chromatic Dragon, a stubby-legged dragon with 5 chromatic dragon heads, and the Undying Queen, a Dracolich version of the Chromatic Dragon. Bonus: the DM is always right. This entry is my first addition to the Iceberg. It is a well-used adage in the D&D community, but can mean different things to different groups. The core concept is that the DM in any group is always correct, even if they aren't. The role of a DM is not simply to act as a strict arbiter of rules, but to create an immersive role-playing experience for their group. Nothing breaks immersion more than an argument over the interpretation of rules. Additionally, and perhaps controversially, it is sometimes, for some groups, permissible for the DM to play loose with rules for the purposes of storytelling, whether that be a fudged roll here, or allowing the rule of cool there. With my own DM, if a player in our group thinks he's misapplied a rule, we're allowed to mention it briefly, and the DM then has complete discretion on deciding the outcome. Whatever he decides then and there stands. He welcomes us sending information to him after the session to correct him, when it isn't disruptive, but in the moment there's a hard rule that we can mention it, but whatever decision he makes is gospel. This ensures our games are not disrupted by long discussions on the interpretation of rules, and our general attitude as players is that we trust our DM to make decisions to give us the best storytelling experience. I think the best summary is that the DM runs the game, and therefore they run the game they want to run. Different DMs may have different interpretations of rules, set house rules, have different attitudes to fudge rolls, etc., and that is their prerogative. As a player, you can always choose to find another group if you don't like how a DM runs their games. It is true that in a minority of situations, some DMs are enacting power fantasies and playing loose with rules for less than savoury reasons. However, the same principle applies that you can, and should, find another group in that case. Bonus 2. Metagaming. If a player metagames, they're using out-of-character knowledge, or in other words, information the character does not know, when making decisions in-game for their character. Metagaming is seen as not being in the spirit of role-playing, and is considered cheating by some. Metagaming can be overt cheating by pre-reading adventure guides and using that information in-game if your DM is running modules, or can be more subtle by using information a character does not know in-game when making decisions. It can even include a player's own knowledge of mechanics, though this certainly becomes murky in encounters when players are incentivised to use the actions most likely to keep them alive. A subcategory of metagaming, in my view at least, is min-maxing or power gaming, where a player chooses skills and perks which provide them with the most objective power, rather than those which might best suit their character. In some cases, efficient allocations and selecting the most powerful skills might be justifiable in character, though this sort of character can fall into the trap of being a boring carbon copy. And additionally, players could still be using their out-of-character knowledge of game mechanics to influence their decisions. Power gaming can also result in power imbalances at the table, which risks sidelining other player characters. There are different levels of metagaming, and whilst some are more innocuous than others, generally, minimising most forms of metagaming will result in a better role-playing experience for everyone. Below the surface. This is where we start to see entries that only D&D enthusiasts would know about, though some entries might also be known to those with an immersion in internet culture, especially the more iconic stories. As a warning, I will omit an entry in this section and another in the next section, because they are, or can be considered, piracy tools or resources. Call me a wet blanket, but I don't know enough about copyright law to confidently discuss them. They are the only two entries I will omit, and there wouldn't be much to say beyond what they're used for. Bag of Black Hole. In 3.5e, a portable hole is a magical item constituted by a combination of phase spiderweave, beams of starlight, and strands of ether. Before use, it resembles a circular piece of cloth, and once placed on a surface, it creates a portal to another dimension, which is 6 foot in diameter and 10 foot deep. It's used to store items, but anything can be placed in there, including living beings. Though, once the portal's closed, there would only be enough air for a creature to live for around 10 minutes. A bag of holding is another magical item that is larger on the inside than it is on the outside, about 2 foot in diameter and 4 foot deep. If it's torn, ruptured, pierced, or overloaded, it's destroyed and all its content will be scattered across the astral plane. Ever wonder what would happen if you put a bag of holding in a portable hole? I can tell you. Both the bag and portable hole are sucked into the void and lost. Alright, what if you put a portable hole in a bag of holding though? Well, a gate to the astral plane is created, then the hole, bag, and any creature within a 10-foot radius are drawn in, destroying the hole and bag in the process. It is a one-way gateway. That sounds pretty exploitable. Yep. This is an over-engineered insta-banishment to the astral plane. Let's hope the ranger doesn't roll a 1. Tarrasque karaoke. This entry refers to Dingo Doodle's story about Sips, the wild mage, and their drunken karaoke performance with severe consequences. I've added a link to the video in the description below. It's a funny story based on a wild mage who, in trying to give a stellar performance, inadvertently creates a dead magic zone during said karaoke performance, which leads to the release of a Tarrasque imprisoned under the city. The story escalates further and further as roles make the situation worse and worse. It's a great example of a story which someone can enjoy whether they've played D&D before or not, and I expect it introduced the game to a good number of current players, which is always a good thing. That guy, rules lawyer. We all know that guy. He can be a lot of different things, but they're all infuriating. He could be a rules lawyer, who robs the joy of D&D by arguing with the DM over minor rules to his own benefit, often incorrectly, but always conveniently for him. That guy might be the one who steals the limelight. That guy could be the one who actually steals from other PCs, or even kills them. That guy could be the one who doesn't pay attention until it's his turn, then insists on someone giving him a breakdown of what he missed. That guy could be the one who is metagaming at the table, or the one whose character is min to the max. That guy adds extra gold into his inventory here and there behind the DM's back. That guy might even be the creeper who hassles players in and out of character, and who ignores boundaries. That guy could also have poor hygiene. That guy is the guy who generally makes the experience less fun for everyone at the table. Don't be that guy. Sir Barrington. This is a classic green text story, and one of my first exposures to the wide storytelling possibilities D&D can offer. If it's a true story, the DM seems to have played loose with the rules for the sake of fun, which I think is totally acceptable for player enjoyment, as long as it doesn't lead to imbalances. I'll read the green text for you now. Make a bear character in D&D 3.5. DM laughs. Make bear a rogue. Put every point I can into disguise. Prestige class as a spy to get more disguise. DM says I can't speak English. Max out bluff. By growling and gesturing, I can fake speaking a language I don't speak. English. Use money to hire a butler NPC. Give him magical item to let him speak bear. Growl. An excellent suggestion, Mr. Barrington. We really should ask the group to investigate the Black Marsh. Over the course of the game, be knighted to Sir Barrington. Queen holds a dinner in my honour. A guest becomes the first man to ever make a perception check that can beat my disguise. Shouts out loud. Hey, that guy's not a guy, he's just a bear. Man is escorted out of the castle while the guards apologise profusely for the indignity. We're so sorry, Sir Barrington. Very sorry for this man's behaviour. Roar. Shrug. I rolled to seduce the dragon. For the uninitiated, you might ask, who in their right mind would roll to seduce a dragon? And to answer that question, I won't offer an individual, but a class. Bards. Bards are notorious for playing campaigns as Casanovas, rolling their way into hearts and bedrooms. The idea of rolling to seduce a dragon is a meme or joke in the D&D community, though if you look it up, you'll find plenty of players telling their stories of attempting, successfully or unsuccessfully, to seduce dragons. Some are more wholesome than others. Tomb of Horrors. Tomb of Horrors is iconic in the D&D community, though I'm still undecided on whether it's fame or infamy. There is no doubt that it's beloved though. Developed by Gary Gygax in 1975 for tournament play in the Origins 1 convention, and later published in 1978, Tomb of Horrors is an adventure module set in the world of Greyhawk. Gygax developed the module to challenge the expert players in his group, whose characters, up until that point, had become so powerful that they were nigh invincible. The dungeon itself has a focus on traps and puzzles rather than combat, which was the first module to do so, and has strong incentives to make poor decisions in the pursuit of riches. More likely, the PCs will find death, or complete annihilation. The plot surrounds the undead wizard, Esper, in his ancient tomb, with adventurers attempting to slay him and take his treasure. There are stories all over the internet of players' ingenious plans to beat the tomb, with varying degrees of success. But even with a solid plan, bad luck will end a run. In 1998, the Return to the Tomb of Horrors module was released, again focused on Esper, and is itself considered one of the greatest D&D modules in history. Are you sure? For the love of God, if your DM asks you this question, stop, think, and consider not doing that thing. DMs generally want players to have the freedom to judge how their character would act, so if they ask you this question, you're probably on the verge of permadeath, or are about to derail their campaign in some way. Personally, I often ignore my own advice here. If I've made a decision in character, I don't generally like to retcon it. However, in my particular situation, my DM likes to psych us out sometimes and make us doubt ourselves for his own amusement, so it's a slightly different situation. Centaur stacking. Centaurs can be ridden by medium-sized creatures. Centaurs are themselves medium-sized creatures. Therefore, centaurs can ride centaurs, and there is nothing holy in this world. Turn undead. Clerics have the ability to turn undead. Whilst this sounds like an epic skill whereby clerics turn undead back into dead beings, change their alignment, or perhaps even turn creatures into undead creatures, the reality is that Turn Undead quite literally turns undead enemies around by pushing them 15 feet away. It's a channel divinity where essentially a holy light causes the undead to retreat somewhat into self-defense. Still, a very useful spell, though it sounds a lot cooler than it really is. Sigil. The D&D multiverse is made up of multiple planes and realms of existence. The material plane is the default setting for most adventures. Each plane has its own rules, laws, and features which make it unique, and they can vary drastically from being hell realms to realms of elements, energies, and even death. There have been different cosmological explanations for the relationship between realms through D&D's history, though currently in 5e, the Great Wheel cosmology is the most popular. The Sigil is a hub city floating in the Outlands, containing multiple portals to every plane, and it's therefore important for interplanar travel. Inhabitants consider themselves the centre of the multiverse for this reason. An interesting feature of the Sigil is that it has no sky. There are buildings around its edge with no windows facing out, but beyond that there is nothing. Falling off the edge would result in being sent to a random plane. The Sigil is ruled by the Lady of Pain, who controls all of the portals. She's less concerned with the day-to-day running of the city, but will swiftly and severely punish any who cause trouble, either through death or by sending them to one of the inescapable Ladies' Mazes. As the Sigil is a hub, items from across the multiverse can be found there, regardless of how obscure they may be. The city itself is neutral, meaning anyone can enter and are forbidden from fighting or causing trouble, regardless of alignment or status. It could therefore be a good place for a DM to facilitate a motley crew party meeting one another. Pathfinder. Pathfinder is a modified version of D&D 3.5e, sometimes called 3.75e, and was released under the then Open Game license. It was published by Paizo Publishing in response to the then upcoming 4e version of D&D's more restrictive game license system, which would have afforded less freedom in publishing content within D&D systems. Pathfinder was at times more popular than D&D during the 4e period, though this changed upon the release of 5e. However, it does still have a significant following. Pathfinder is set in the world of Golarion, and has had multiple forms of media based on the system, including books, card games, and video games. Some still consider Pathfinder to be the superior RPG system. TSR. Oh boy. This is where we delve a bit deeper into the politics and business surrounding D&D, and as always, it's pretty spicy. We've already heard a bit about TSR in the Gary Gygax entry, though here we'll delve a bit deeper. First, as a reminder, TSR is the original publishing company for D&D created by Gary Gygax and Don Kay. The first dispute surrounds Dave Arneson, the co-creator of D&D along with Gygax. Gygax did not acknowledge Arneson's intellectual property claims of later versions of D&D, claiming that Advanced Dungeons & Dragons was significantly different to 1E and not a game which Arneson helped to create. This was resolved, finally, in 1997, after D&D was at that point owned by Wizards of the Coast, for the purposes of releasing Advanced Dungeons & Dragons under the Dungeons & Dragons name. The fee Arneson received was not disclosed. In 1973, Brian Bloom was brought into TSR to help finance the company. However, when Don Kay died suddenly in 1975, the company was run by Gygax and Bloom alone. Gygax reluctantly allowed Brian's father, Melvin, to buy Don's widow's share, which left the Blooms with the majority share. Brian's brother, Kevin, later purchased Melvin's shares, which gave the brothers a controlling interest in the company. The company was split by the Blooms into TSR Inc. and TSR Entertainment, giving Gygax presidency of TSR Entertainment to develop TV and movie opportunities. This is why Gygax was living in Hollywood when we talked about this period of his life in the Gary Gygax section. Later, Gygax found out that much of the financial issues TSR faced were down to Brian Bloom's mismanagement, and he successfully had Brian removed by the board. He then used his 700 share stock option to give himself majority control of the company, and made himself CEO and president. He hired Lorraine Williams as a company manager, and then dismissed the other 3 directors. This backfired though, as the Blooms triggered their own stock option and sold it to Lorraine Williams, giving her majority share. Gygax attempted to prevent this through the courts, but was unsuccessful. Williams then took the role of president and CEO herself, and told Gygax that no further creative contributions to TSR would be accepted. The following year, Gygax resigned all positions at TSR and settled his disputes with TSR, losing the rights to almost everything except a few individual characters. Spicy stuff, and whilst I do feel for Gary, he pulled a fair few shenanigans himself. Barbarians. A barbarian, as you might guess, is a class combination of a bard and barbarian. As a combination, it could lead to an interesting character to roleplay, and does have the benefit of making a bard more useful in combat, and a barbarian more useful out of combat. It does have limitations, as a build, specifically in that Barbarian Rage would interrupt the concentration required for some spells. However, Bardic Inspiration is unaffected and can be used during a rage. You can find a link of how to create the character in the description below. Overthinking. Hang on Dave, are you sure you just want to walk through that door? In fact, why are we walking at all? What if something happens? Frankly, Dave, I'm starting to think we should just stop playing. We've all been overly cautious at times. Sometimes an inflection in our DM's voice might make us suspicious. Other times, it's all in our minds. In some ways, I think all players need to play overcautiously at some point, if only to better understand when they're overdoing it. An element of overthinking makes players better, I think, though a complete lack of thought is what sometimes leads to the best stories. No judgment here either way, play the game you want to play. Munchkin. We've already been over power gaming in the metagaming entry in the tip of this iceberg. A Munchkin is a power gamer who has the additional trait of competitiveness. They don't just want to be the best at the table, they want to win the game against the other players. It's a derogatory term, and an old one at that, apparently dating back to 1984. D&D animated show. An animated show based on D&D, simply called Dungeons & Dragons, was produced by Marvel and TSR from 1983 to 1985. It was animated by Toei Animation, who also animated the Dragon Ball series. I almost included a joke about 10 sequential episodes of DBZ using the same 4 frames of animation whilst Goku charges a spirit bomb, but I'm too big of a fan of Dragon Ball to do Toei dirty like that for laughs. The premise of the Dungeons & Dragons show is that a group of children and teenagers are transported to the world of D&D and must find their way home. They're aided in this journey by Dungeon Master, and have a primary antagonist in the form of the wizard Venga. They face other enemies throughout, including Tiamat, who we've already discussed, and each protagonist has magical items which support them in their journey, which specifically relate to their class role. The show's final episode was never released, as the series was cancelled before it could be produced. However, the script had already been written, and had been available online for some time. Fans have animated this script and uploaded it online, so those who want to watch the ending can do so with relative ease. Though, as a warning, the ending itself is more definitive than the script intended, and the clips are largely reused from elsewhere in the series. Infinity Engine and NN. The Infinity Engine is a game engine developed by BioWare, which was the engine used to create 5 iconic D&D licensed isometric RPGs, including Baldur's Gate, Planescape Torment, Icewind Dale, Baldur's Gate 2, and Icewind Dale 2. There are also various expansions and enhanced editions which use the engine, however those were the main franchises. The Infinity Engine was initially an RTS engine, but was repurposed for isometric RPGs and licensed to Black Isle Studios. In more recent years, fans have reverse engineered the engine and created tools to edit game files, with an open source recreation even being available to develop on. The Infinity Engine was succeeded by the Aurora engine, which was the engine used to create the Neverwinter Nights RPGs. That was my first foray into the Forgotten Realms, so I do have fond memories playing that series. Ed Greenwood. As we already know from the last section of the iceberg, Ed Greenwood was the original creator of the Forgotten Realms setting. In day-to-day life, Greenwood is a library clerk, which makes a lot of sense considering his love of books and publishing. Greenwood also regularly attends D&D conventions dressed as Elminster from his Elminster series of books, so in many ways I think Ed Greenwood is what many aspire to be. Passionate about his interests, successful and popular within his community, and unapologetically himself. I won't go on for too long, and certainly don't want to come across as a giddy fanboy, but I do have an enormous respect for Ed Greenwood. I cast Fireball, Eldritch Blast. I think this entry refers to the tendency for some wizards and warlocks with their wide range of spells to default to either Fireball or Eldritch Blast. It's easy to see why. Both spells are very effective combat spells in most situations, and for warlocks, this is especially important considering their more limited spellbooks. If you're a DM who's had enough of players using the same spells, there are lots of ways you might address it. You could use fire or force resistant enemies, have enemies use counterspell and other similar spells. You could think about enemy placement in encounters to disincentivise the spells, and could even look at spell components and use effects to limit those components to encourage more creative play. That said, some players are less interested in combat and prefer other RPG mechanics, interactions, and exploration. So as long as your players are having fun, I don't think it's the end of the world if there's a warlock sitting at the back, shooting a few beams of energy out of his hands. If I'd made the Spirit Bomb joke earlier, a lazy Kamehameha joke would have been perfect here. Arkhan steals the hand of Vecna. Spoiler warning, skip to the next section if you're currently watching Critical Role. Arkhan is a Dragonborn Paladin / Barbarian played by Joe Manganiello in the Critical Role podcast. He was a player character who, along with the main party, fought Vecna, an arch-lich who at that point had ascended to godhood. The party managed to seal Vecna's divine form outside of the prime material plane, beyond the divine gate, to permanently seal him away. The only thing remaining was his hand. Arkhan announced that it was time to destroy the hand of Vecna, however at the last minute, he chopped off his own hand, attached Vecna's hand to himself, healed himself, and teleported away. It was an epic betrayal, and one which has gone down as legendary for those that watch Critical Role. Out of character, Joe had spoken with the DM about his character's motivations previously, so it wasn't a total shock. However, Matt did not know how Joe intended to try to steal it, so was likely as entertained as the rest of us. Red Box. The Red Box is the D&D game's starter set, containing a player book and a DM book, as well as character sheets, maps, tokens, dice, and cards to help new players get started with D&D. From what I can tell, the 4E version is what is usually referred to as the Red Box. However, the 1983 revision of the original basic set is when the first Red Box was released. The basic sets will be the first experience many players and DMs have with D&D, especially before online platforms and resources became so prevalent. So for those that have been playing for some time, the Red Boxes will be quite nostalgic. The prices of certain editions certainly reflect that. Bonus. Forever DM. The person in the group who is most into D&D is often, unfortunately, also the one who never gets to play. Being a DM is fun in its own right, but it takes a lot of time and preparation to give players fulfilling role-playing experiences, so even the most enthusiastic and committed DM has probably wanted to just play D&D sometimes. However, either because none of their players know enough about D&D to DM, or they just don't have the time or will, they must remain the Forever DM. My own DM had been a Forever DM for some time. However, he's recently found another group to play with, which brings me great joy. I've run a couple of one-shots before, however he is actually unable to attend both, which did not bring me joy. Bonus 2. Racist? This is a broad topic, the question of whether D&D is racist or not. It's another controversy surrounding D&D, much like the Satanic Panic, though one which I think should be taken more seriously. I think in some ways, D&D could always be labelled as having elements of racism by design, as different player races have different essential attributes, and there are even similar personality traits among particular races, which necessarily leads to tropes and stereotypes, even if they are only of fantasy creatures. Whilst races in D&D are more distinct than ethnic races in the real world, and they're effectively different species, it could be argued that the presence of these differences might reinforce stereotypes to players in the real world. Though here, I think it is important to note that this conclusion is probably another moral panic, as I doubt D&D has ever made anyone racist. Rather, it's far more likely that the racist who plays D&D was already a racist. I could be wrong though, so I would always keep an open mind, and it's definitely a question worth asking. Other questions around racism in D&D could surround the origin of some of the races, and whether even though they're fancy creatures, they're built on a racist foundation, which were just veiled stereotypes of real ethnicities or cultures. For example, orcs being evil, uncivilized and brutish does bear a similarity to some historic racist attitudes towards non-Western cultures. Whilst that's an important question to ask, orcs were a fantasy staple before D&D, so the question is one that needs to be aimed at the fantasy genre as a whole, rather than one at D&D specifically. There could also be the unintentional and non-malicious forms of racism in certain modules, representing stereotypes of real ethnicities, such as Oriental adventures, which can be insensitive at times and utilised harmful tropes. I don't have a strong position on racism in D&D. To be clear, I'm a staunch anti-racist and would not support racism in any form. However, in this case, I don't feel equipped enough to really say one way or the other if D&D is definitively racist. It's clear there have been cultural insensitivities in the past, however Wizards of the Coast are grappling with the question and doing what they can to avoid insensitivities in the future. The other question of different player races having different characteristics really isn't avoidable by design and are intrinsic to gameplay. However, they don't seem to be based in any real racist racial tropes to me, though again, the orc case in particular might show something darker in the fantasy genre as a whole, even if it isn't something unique to D&D. Bonus 3. No demons/devils in AD&D. Moving back to the more ridiculous controversies of D&D, the second edition of Advanced Dungeons & Dragons actually had reference to devils and demons removed as a result of the moral panic surrounding Satanism and D&D. It isn't totally clear if they're removed to appease the moral panickers, or if they're removed to protect players from being targeted, but their removal was in name only. Devils were simply renamed the Bartizu, and demons renamed the Tanari. It's still an interesting piece of D&D history though. Middle of the iceberg. This is the first section where you really only know if you know. At this point, you would need to be a D&D enthusiast to know the entries. Browsing 4chan and Reddit is likely not enough, unless you're specifically browsing TG or D&D next. Spelljammer. Spelljammer is both a setting and a ship. The setting is a fantasy setting based in outer space. It's based predominantly on the prime material plane, so even though travellers may go into space, they're often not plane hopping. The setting is like other D&D settings, with the ships being more like galleons than rockets, and it's explained in setting by crystal spheres which surround planets, wild space beyond and between those, and spelljamming helms and gravity atmosphere fields on ships which allow navigation of the wild space between spheres. The Spelljammer ship is a living ship that looks like a manta ray and has a city on its back. It travels between different spheres aimlessly whilst unmanned, though with more direction if it has a captain. If it's destroyed, one of its spawn, the small jammers, will become the next Spelljammer, however there can only be one full ship at a time. Spelljamming is just the process of travelling between crystal spheres and has been used as a way of connecting different D&D worlds stroke settings, though the Planescape setting later replaced Spelljammer setting as the predominant means of connecting settings, which fits with the Great Wheel cosmology more neatly, though each subsequent edition of D&D has had some reference to Spelljammer content. Mazes and Monsters. You might recognise this name from the Satanic Panic in the last video. Mazes and Monsters was first a novel and later a movie, which was based on the story of James Darlus Egbert III. It lent into the discredited interpretation that James was LARPing a version of D&D and became lost in the tunnels beneath his school. The made-for-TV version of the story, starring Tom Hanks, tells a story wherein a group of troubled teens meet, organise a LARP, and in the process Robbie, Tom Hanks' character, suffers a permanent psychotic break, with the movie ending showing him stuck in fiction. It was certainly a product of the moral panic surrounding D&D at the time. Kobold Press. Kobold Press, or Open Design, is a game company who produce role-playing games and supplements. Initially, they had a focus on the patronage crowdfunding model for game releases, wherein games have limited releases for backers. However, more recently they've released games publicly, and even been commissioned to produce adventures by Wizards of the Coast. Chainmail. We've already made reference to Chainmail in the section on Gary Gygax. Developed with Jeff Perrin, Chainmail was a medieval miniature game that preceded Dungeons & Dragons. The game is much closer to fantasy wargaming systems like Warhammer, with rules for both mass combat and one-to-one combat. All-barbarian party. What are you guys playing? A Dwarven Barbarian. I also rolled a Barbarian. We all roll Barbarians too. Well gents, let's do this. The story is too long for me to read out in its entirety, but this story is another classic green text story. I've left a link in the description below, but there's lots of humour surrounding a mostly illiterate party, their misguided attempts at magic, and a final heroic confrontation, which involves a bag of holding and portable hoe. Rest in peace, Eurus. City of Brass. The City of Brass is a floating city on the elemental plane of fire. The city itself sits in a 40-mile hemisphere of brass, which is what gives the city the ability to fly. The city hovers very slowly. Many of the effects of the plane of fire are suppressed within the city limits to facilitate interplanar trade. However, the general alignment of the city does hinder those of good alignment due to the surrounding portals which lead to the Nine Hells. The city is governed by the Grand Sultan. It's by his will that the effects of the plane of fire are suppressed. The Sultan is Efreet, as is the city. 20% of the population are slaves to the Efreeti masters. Many of these slaves originally came to the City of Brass as tourists, but by defaulting on loans or committing other offences, were made slaves for a period of time. These slaves are often tasked with cultivating the obsidian fields, which host crops found from across the plane of fire. Pun Pun. I've called min-maxers out up until this point, but what a min-maxer does is still a fundamentally interesting question, even if it doesn't make for a fun role-playing experience. How powerful can I make myself by manipulating in-game mechanics? Enter Pun Pun, the world's strongest kobold. Pun Pun is quite literally the pinnacle of creation, the most powerful you can make a playable character through cheesing. It's complicated to summarise exactly how Pun Pun achieves its demigodhood, and I'll probably butcher it, but essentially, Pun Pun has a divine minion, which has the fast wild shape ability, which allows Pun Pun to wild shape into a Saruk. Pun Pun then uses assumed supernatural ability to use the manipulate form ability, which he then uses to give the manipulate form ability to his divine minion. Pun Pun then dismisses the Saruk form. Then, the divine minion gives Pun Pun the manipulate form ability, using the manipulate form ability, which is very important. Pun Pun can now cast giant size on his divine minion, which gives plus 32 strength. It can then use manipulate form to give Pun Pun plus 32 strength permanently, which is based on the Viper's own stats at that point. Pun Pun then dismisses giant size on the minion, casts it on himself, then casts manipulate form on his minion to also increase his minion's base stats. This can go on ad infinitum. For other spells, other ability scores can be increased in the same way, and with such arbitrarily high stats, other spells, abilities and attacks can easily be gained through further cheesing. The reason this works really boils down to the fact that the wording of manipulate form allows you to only increase other people's scores based on your own score. But as you have a temporary boost, which you give them, then change form back to normal and receive it back yourself, it creates the ability to make that boost permanent. There's a lot more to this character build, but for the sake of brevity, I've tried to keep it brief. See the link in the description below for a full breakdown of what is possible. Blibdul Pulp. The Quotao are amphibious fishmen. They were enslaved by mind flayers, and this enslavement had a permanent effect on the psyche of the people. To put it bluntly, they were completely and utterly mad. Through the intensity of their madness and religious fervour, they willed their own gods into existence through their insanity alone. Blibdul Pulp is their patron goddess and protector. She has the head and claws of a lobster and body of a naked woman. Known as the Sea Mother, she was irrational and unpredictable herself, and had a strong hatred towards mind flayers and drows who caused suffering to her people. The goddess would accept offerings of pearls, lobsters and dead drow for favour, and could bestow either positive or negative magical effects on others. She can make you mad, or allow you the ability to cast a spell to transform a hand into a lobster claw. She at one point owned a necklace which could produce pearls, however this was stolen by the demigoddess D&Definitive after she disguised herself as a Quotao. TG. TG is the 4chan board dedicated to tabletop gaming. It's a source for most of the green text we have already seen in this iceberg, as well as many more. The board is open to all forms of tabletop gaming, but Warhammer, Magic the Gathering, Yu-Gi-Oh! And D&D make up a large part of the content, as you might expect. As far as 4chan goes, it's a board which is mostly dedicated to the hobbies themselves, and whilst I wouldn't necessarily say it's free from the worst aspects of 4chan, the community is focused on the hobby and don't have the same negative attitudes as some other boards. Still a lot of cringe at times though. 1D4chan. 1D4chan is a wiki which is dedicated to the TG board. It has entries on the games themselves, but also on memes and green text which originated on the TG board. It's a great resource for someone like me who's doing a video on D&D. Its server has been up and down over the years, but is currently very much up. The Dread Gazebo. Kicking off with a classic, the tale of Eric and the Dread Gazebo was published in physical press, Alarums and Excursions by Richard Aronson. The article tells the story of Ed Whitchurch DMing for a player named Eric Sorensen. Eric is described as a precise and efficient gamer who, after being told by the DM that a gazebo is sitting on a hill, asks its colour, size, tries to detect alignment, then attacks it. Once it was clear he could not do any damage, he runs away in fear. Eric likely thought the gazebo was a Glabrezu, one of the earliest demons found in D&D. If anyone's in any doubt, this is a gazebo. There is some question to the veracity of this story. It's very similar to a story in Don Quixote, where Don Quixote sees giants in the distance and, not want to shy away from adventure, charges towards them, finds himself unable to fight them, then rationalises that a magician must be hiding their form to Sancho Panza, who has from the start seen that they were, in fact, windmills. Whether the Dread Gazebo was inspired by Don Quixote is itself a question Cervantes would have loved to play with, as he writes in the sequel to Don Quixote, though part of the same book we read today, of an impostor, a false Don Quixote, who roamed the countryside and pretended to be Don Quixote, which is a reference to a false sequel to the novel that was written before Cervantes could finish the real sequel. An impostor stealing one of Don Quixote's achievements will be fertile ground for a deeper, more confusing reference. The stolen adventure from a fictional adventurer who himself had a canonical impostor pretending to be the adventurer himself, which itself was based on a real false sequel of the adventurer's adventure. The head spins, much like the windmill. Modron Court. Modrons are a race in D&D who place supreme emphasis on following the principles of law and order in all situations. They are lawful neutral creatures, as you might imagine, and are in fact the embodiment of the universal principle of order. Modrons have a strict hierarchical structure in their society, which is also reflected in their physiology. Monodrons, at the lowest level of society, are geometric shapes, and the more sides they have, the higher their rank. The highest ranking Modrons are humanoid in shape. Monodrons are the most basic, then duodrones, tridrones, quadrones, and pentadrones. Beyond these base castes, there are hierarchs starting with decatons, moving all the way to tertian and secundus, all under their ruler, Primus. Each Modron will follow all orders given to it by a Modron one rank higher. It will also follow orders from those of higher ranks, though they cannot psychologically process higher ranks, so a tridrone, receiving an order from a pentadrone, would think that it was a very powerful quadrone instead. Strangers trying to navigate the bureaucracy of the Modrons would find themselves having to appear multiple times before clerks, courts, and boards. This entry, I suspect, is in reference to the parallels between Modron courts and Joseph K's bureaucratic nightmare in Franz Kafka's novel The Trial. In it, Joseph is arrested and prosecuted for a crime which is not specified and never made clear throughout the novel. Joseph makes consistent efforts to find out his crime and is summoned to a court without being given an exact time or even room. Upon finding the room in the attic, he is chastised for being late. Throughout the story, Joseph meets other accused, meets with other clerks for advice, though they have no power over the situation either, and fundamentally cannot get anywhere. This would not be quite the same as Modron Court, as they do follow procedure strictly, though the absurdity of multiple courts and being forced to appear and reappear is not dissimilar to the bureaucratic hell that Joseph faced. Half-Orca. I'm sure that at some point this has been the name of some female orc hero of a campaign. Let's not forget adding an A feminises all. Except, in this case, orcas are an actual thing. Here is a half-orca. The race itself seems to be the half-orca, rather than a specific cross of a separate orca whale race and humans, though please don't ask how this race came into being. This is a family-friendly channel. Al-Qadim. Al-Qadim is a campaign setting based loosely on the folktales from the Middle Eastern 1001 Nights. Originally, it was supposed to have quite a limited run, with only a 2-year plan for content. However, material was released later for 3.5e, having initially been released under AD&D. The setting, as you might expect, has strong similarities to real Middle Eastern cultures and histories, with approximations for both their language, Madani to Arabic, religion, a pastiche of Islam, and political structures, e.g. a ruling caliph, as well as ways of life, nomadic city life. Because the focus of the setting is to have a Middle Eastern feel, the predominant races are human, human-like creatures, or half-human creatures, with fate being a constant principle. The setting was eventually incorporated into the southern part of Toril in the Forgotten Realm setting. Whilst not quite as cringe-inducing culturally for me personally as Oriental Adventures, this setting does fall into the pitfalls of generalising cultures and peoples, including the prevalence of Western tropes of the Middle East, such as honour killings, which leads to misrepresentation and over-representation of certain views, which can be harmful. As before, attitudes to how cultural material should be handled have changed since the setting's release, and I'm sure intentions were good. However, we can certainly see the problems with it today. Fantasy can be a good excuse for exploring hypothetical cultures which do have distinct elements which aren't pleasant, but when it's such a close approximation to something real, the fantasy argument does feel a bit hollow. Burke. This is an example of slang in a specific setting, specifically planar slang from the planar cant of the Planescape setting, especially prevalent within the Sigil. Berk means a fool or loser, especially one who got himself into a mess when he should have known better. This one was hard for me to identify, because frankly, Berk is slang in British, and means pretty much the same thing, so I did have to get M. Christopher, the creator of this Iceberg, to clarify. In real life, it originates from Cockney rhyming slang, though it's used quite widely, I'd say. However, it's definitely not the most prominent insult you hear. It's quite light-hearted, but to be honest, even the worst words in English can be endearing with the right tone. The word daft before anything helps towards that end as well. Satan. Satan existed in the AD&D 1st edition, though he was explicitly excluded from the 2nd edition as a result of the Satanic Panic. Satan, in lore, briefly ruled the Nine Hells, though was usurped by Beelzebub, after Belial was the only archdevil to side with him in a contention to his rule, and both ended up exiled. Beelzebub himself was later usurped by Asmodeus, and Asmodeus removed almost all references to Satan and Lucifer from their history. Satan is mentioned in the Book of Vile Darkness in the 3rd edition, though to my knowledge there have not been many, if any, references to Satan since then. The reason for this is of course no longer due to the Satanic Panic, but rather, according to some sources, because of a combination of generally avoiding close reference to real-world religions, but also because in the system there is not much space for Satan when Asmodeus is the most powerful archdevil. Oglaf. Oglaf was, according to the creator, originally supposed to be a form of D&D based drawn pornography, but quickly transformed into sex-based comedy. I won't claim to be a viewer, or maybe I'm just not admitting it. However, upon my quick browse of the site, there seem to be classics such as Cut Sprite and Pink Eye. Definitely not suitable for under 18s, and think I might be scarred. Dragon and Dungeon magazine. I appreciated M. Christopher mentioning Dragon magazine before Dungeon magazine in this entry, as I'd likely have spent an hour trying to research a non-existent Dungeon and Dragon magazine. All the cool kids clearly check their syntax. Ambiguity is for Berks. Both magazines are official TSR or WOTC products, obviously depending on the current D&D publisher at that specific point in time. Dragon magazine was first printed in 1976 as a follow-up to TSR's earlier publication, The Strategic Review. The magazine is what you might expect from a D&D magazine, containing content and articles on topics ranging from supplementary material and stories to discussions on metagaming and deep dives on monsters. Being an official product gave it an element of freedom to add lore in a more official capacity than other publications. Dungeon magazine came a little bit later, first being published in 1986, and specifically targeted DMs. The magazine was largely made up of pre-tested and scripted scenarios, as well as adventures and modules for DMs to either use with players directly or adapt for their own campaigns. Both magazines had their final issues released in 2013, prior to the release of 5e. For Dungeon magazine, it's clear that WOTC were planning the release of the Adventurers League Organised Play, which we've already looked at in this Iceberg. In addition, both magazines have been digital only since 2007, so we can assume physical readership was waning prior to the release of 5e. As we know, the accessible game mechanics of 5e drove a resurgence in popularity for D&D, so prior to this, it would not be surprising that this type of media might have had a declining viewership. The release of a new edition is the perfect time to rejuvenate the media on offer, though it's always sad to lose staples of the community. Amy the Am. This is a great green text where, after a little girl tells Amy that she wants to be an adventurer too, Amy begins describing the horrors of adventuring in gruesome and inappropriate details, pleading for her not to become an adventurer. This sends the girl into tears and she runs away. However, the story culminates in Amy revealing the real reason to his party, that being to prevent further competition for getting good jobs. An indeed. DMS Guild. DMS Guild is a platform which allows creators to produce D&D content in a way which is supported by Wizards of the Coast. Essentially, creators can produce anything from adventures and scenarios to backgrounds, classes and monsters. These creations are monetized, with the creator receiving 50% of royalties on products sold. DMS Guild is somewhat divisive. Some people dislike it because Wizards of the Coast are taking 50% of all sales on something which they had no hand in producing. Others think this is less of an issue, as it's all based on their intellectual property, and therefore providing any way for the content to be released and monetized is more than is required of them. On balance, if they didn't do this, there would likely be more pirating. The more problematic aspect of DMS Guild is that the creations effectively become the property of Wizards of the Coast if they're sold through this platform, which means the creator is giving up potential creative control and claims of ownership to the material they've spent a long time creating. The alternative is for individuals to do their own marketing and sales on platforms like Kickstarter, though, to avoid any IP or copyright issues, there are a few hoops, declarations and statements to avoid which ensure the material can be monetised, which could be more of a headache and leave a lingering anxiety. I'm sure different creators will have different preferences, and that's probably for the best. Deep Iceberg. At this point of the iceberg, even being a D&D enthusiast probably isn't enough. You need to take D&D seriously and keep track of niche threads of trivia actively. The Luminous Being. The Luminous Being is above all other gods, and in being above other gods and their domains, is above crystal spheres. The Luminous Being is outside time and space, existing eternally, and has the qualities of both warmth and cold harshness. Lord Al, the overgod of Abir Turil, needed to report to the Luminous Being as an entity beyond normal cosmology, which indicates that the total power of Win Abir Turil that Lord Al has is below that which the Luminous Being is capable of. Little else is known about the Luminous Being in D&D lore, unless the DM is the Luminous Being. DMs are beyond the cosmology of D&D, and have complete power over every aspect of the games, including the most powerful gods. They can cross settings and retcon lore if they want to, just because they have that complete control over their games. It's a cool concept to have the most powerful entities in D&D reporting to our DMs. Sequel films. I'd rather talk about The Rise of Skywalker here. To give the shortest acceptable outline that I can, the 2000 Dungeons & Dragons movie had two sequels. Dungeons & Dragons Wrath of the Dragon God, and Dungeons & Dragons The Book of Vile Darkness. Wrath of the Dragon God surrounds an orb linked to the power of the dragon god Balazur and the pursuit of its power by Damodar. The Book of Vile Darkness tells the story of a man recruited into a knight order to Pelor, but needs to find the Book of Vile Darkness after his entire order and father were killed. That's all you're getting on these films. The Great Mother. The Great Mother is the greater deity responsible for creating beholders. The Great Mother is responsible for creating and birthing beholders, which is why she is considered their mother. The Great Mother looks like a mammoth beholder herself, though her precise features are difficult to pinpoint as her incomprehensible complexity means her form constantly shifts. Beholders have a split psyche, making them borderline insane, so it's probably unsurprising to hear that they remember the Great Mother looking consistent and precisely like them as an individual beholder. Beholders think that the Great Mother thinks like them, nuttily, and whilst from the outside her actions seem consistent with insanity, she is actually very sane and astute, though she is whimsical and impulsive. She is said to be one of the greatest sages on the topic of chaos and evil, though she is like beholders in that she hates lower beings and would never share her knowledge with them. Anything that the Great Mother does not know are things she does not consider to be important. Any beholder she creates, or comes across, that she deems to be offensive or not a reflection of herself, she will destroy or consume. She does help her creations sometimes, though not consistently and not like other deities. Beholders, due to their nature, are rarely priests, though they do all hold her with reverence and awe. It is her attitude of complete superiority which leads to the beholder's self-perception as perfect mortal beings. Ahriman. Thanks to M. Christopher for pointing me to Mr. Rex's video on this topic, linked in the description. I highly recommend watching this video as I'm only giving a brief overview of the topic. In the video, Mr. Rex explores the character of Asmodeus, the Lord of Lies, and notes the lies in his own origin, and how, contrary to the stated origin, Asmodeus himself is Ahriman, one of the twin serpents of lore. Ahriman and Jazarian, the twin serpents, emerged from and worked together on the fundamental order of the universe, including the rule of three, until a disagreement on what should be the centre of reality emerged, heaven or Bator. This tore their auroral unity apart, causing Ahriman's fall to the mortal plane, through the nine hells and producing the serpent's coil at the bottom, wounding him and bounding him by the laws that he himself created, whilst Jazarian was feathered and could fly. His wounds forged Kotal's, whom he uses to gather intelligence on Ahriman. Asmodeus' lies include perpetuating his image as a normal archdevil, and one who is invested in the war between devils and demons. But the reality is that Asmodeus is using this cover to house his real self in the deepest depths of the lowest hell, where only atheists go, where he eats every aspect of those souls to fix his serpentine body's own wounds. Ahriman's final goal is to complete Armageddon. He wants to be free of the laws of the universe that he created, but then fell into and is bound by. that to do so he must recreate the state of initial chaos where he would combine with Gygax and recreate everything again, though ideally not fall this time, so he can remain above creation. Gygax then is the only entity who knows Asmodeus' true identity. It's worth noting that this lore dates back over 20 years now, so it's probably part of legends in lore. Crystal spheres. A crystal sphere is the outer boundary of any collection of planets whose settings are traversable through normal means. We've already made reference to these in the spelljamming section, where a spelljamming vessel traverses the wild space between different crystal spheres to access distant campaign settings. Each crystal sphere has its own gods, whose sphere of influence is contained within the crystal sphere, and who are forbidden from interfering with gods outside of their own crystal sphere. It is said that this is due to an ancient pact, which is only acceptable to break if another god is attempting to break it. It almost sounds like a D&D version of NATO, with the mad doctrine preventing skirmishes into other realms. Crystal spheres come into existence through a process very similar to mitosis, where one sphere starts to grow, a dividing line over time appears, and both continue to grow until they eventually split. The process is said to be very beautiful to watch, even to gods. In addition to this, one way to think of crystal spheres is that every D&D story ever has its own crystal sphere, including homebrew campaigns, and therefore, every possible possibility exists, including other properties. M. Christopher mentioned Marvel, Star Wars, Rick and Morty, etc., which is a very cool concept. I just watched Veritasium's video on parallel worlds, so this mitosis idea of the creation of crystal spheres could also have some headcanon relationship with quantum mechanics, wherein every environmental decoherence results in a split of universes based on separate outcomes, though this canonical explanation goes a bit further, as it not only includes all possible worlds, but the impossible ones too. Oberifs. Oberifs are an ancient eldritch race whose form was so abhorrent that it could drive mortals insane. In other words, they're Lovecraftian horrors. Lovecraft would no doubt have described their horror as indescribable. Oberifs have existed even longer than the gods themselves, existing for so long that they precede the very laws of the universe that at least make the odd and strange comprehensible, and the incomprehensible too is comprehensible in comparison to them. They're from a different reality, one which, through their dark hunger, they consumed, and have infected our own reality with both their hunger and power. Oberifs have largely been wiped out in number after warring with the Tanari, however a few remain. Some held dominion over small, inhospitable corners of existence. Others formed the Queen's Conclave, or Quorum of 12, which attempted to conquer the Abyss to reinstate Oberif supremacy. This society was considered to be a myth, or extinct group, however they fought amongst demon lords. Of these, only Dagon, the Prince of the Darkened Depths, and the leader of the cult of Dagon, was openly acknowledged as an Oberif. The Abyss is of course an evil place, but its original form embodied less of the objective evil it has come to be associated with, and rather embodied a chaotic evil, one which lacked form, and which only Oberif could adapt to the horrors and survive. Part of the reason it's believed that Oberif dominion of the Abyss would bring back the Oberif supremacy is because it's thought that the Oberif Prince of Demons would bring back the conditions by which Oberif can emerge from the Abyss. The Henderson Scale. The Henderson Scale is used to assess how much a given action has affected the plot of an adventure. The scale can indicate an action has impacted the campaign so positively that all plot points, present and future, are resolved in-game. It can indicate that an action has no impact on the plot at all, or, alternatively, the most often used purpose of the scale indicates precisely how much a campaign has been derailed by an action. Its name comes from 1D4chan and alludes to the story of Old Man Henderson. Old Man Henderson is a character created by a player who was outraged when his DM killed his player character unfairly. Old Man Henderson was specifically designed to be confusing, to hide the fact that skills were being added on the fly, and his sole purpose was to derail the DM's campaign. Old Man Henderson is a munchkin, but a munchkin with purpose. His aim was to win, but not just against other players, but the DM himself. Without spoiling the story, I can tell you that by the end, the DM flipped the table in real life. One full Henderson on the scale equates to total derailment of a campaign. Stalking a normal girl. The original poster of this green text describes taking part in an evil campaign with quite gruesome characters, and explains how the only thing his character does is stalk a young girl. Nothing else, he just stalks her. The rest of the group, rightfully I think, find this deeply unsettling in real life and bring it up. Over time, the group suspect there is no ill content involved, and slowly become fond of the young girl, giving her gifts and looking over her. They eventually stop being able to hide their evil acts, and over time transition their evil campaign into a normal one. When the DM says he suspected that this was the original poster's plan all along, he denies it and stabs the girl in the neck. Brutal. That Guy Destroys Psionics. This story has 2 full Hendersons on 1D4chan to give you an initial insight into the shenanigans of this story. This poster really is a that guy from the start. He's finicky and takes offence to others in the group. He even dislikes the DM and setting, so it's bound to end badly. The story is linked in the description, as are the others I mention, but glossing over a fair few details, after being falsely blamed for attacking the BBEG by another player's character, he takes action which successfully causes psionics to be destroyed in a psionics-based campaign. Though, that obviously gets retconned. He manages to do it again, though the DM overrules it again, but responds by setting an unending army of constructs to beat the BBEG into submission anyway, after anchoring him into a plane. This was session 1, and the BBEG wasn't supposed to be attacked in the first place. He was not invited back for another session. Fatal. What would happen if you took Oglaf, made it violent, sprinkled in unnecessarily complex higher level maths, and then turned it into a real tabletop RPG system? You'd get Fatal, the misogynistic, racist and homophobic uncle of tabletop gaming. It's not even very good. It's overly complicated and takes much of the choice in character creation and randomises it, leading to less planned backstories and role-playing experiences. Infamously though, the game does require you to set anal circumference in character creation. I'm sure there are some edgelords out there who love this one. The creators consider it highbrow after all, but for me, it's better left as a quirk in the history of tabletop gaming, rather than a serious system to try out. There are other, edgy, strict violence-based RPGs that actually have workable mechanics if you're desperate for something like this. Fell. I'm not sure what this one refers to, but I'll offer 3 interpretations. 1. It could be a reference to the feat, Fell-handed, which essentially gives the user bonuses when using axe-like weapons. 2. This could refer to Adric Fell, a human fighter who leads a group of 5, Fells 5, in a comic book adventure published by Hasbro. What sets this apart would be the inclusion of things like character sheets in certain versions, and additionally, the attempt to incorporate 4 rules into the comic itself. Loosely, I should add, since sometimes they do play fast and loose. It's certainly like reading a player's story, rather than just a comic book story. 3. Finally, it might refer to Shadowfell, which is essentially the dark counterplane to the Feywild, but rather than being full of magic and fairies, it's full of decay and death. One fun rumour is that the reason it's so dark is because all the light of the place was channeled into a single citadel for the plane, making the shining citadel a bastion of light, though no one has ever found evidence of this. I think the second option, Adric Fell, is the most likely intended meaning, but all 3 are fun to include and why I didn't ask for clarification. Book of Vile Darkness. Totally ignoring the Dungeons & Dragons movie sequel with the same name, which I've already indicated I'd like to avoid, the Book of Vile Darkness only refers to the in-game artifact and in real life sourcebook. The sourcebook is from the 3rd edition and offers mature content with an evil focus to introduce into games, including mechanics surrounding torture and drug use. There are also a variety of classes, spells, items and monsters included. The in-game artifact was initially written by Vecna, transcribing scrolls that fell into his possession, as well as adding his own content. The nature of the book allowed amendments and additions to be made by others later, which made it a bit hodgepodge. It was made from the flesh of a human face and the bones of a demon. Evil spellcaster readers would gain insight and the ability to dominate evil people. Neutral people would be turned evil, and good spellcasters would either be made permanently insane or simply die after reading the book. This is because the book was aware of the reader and could show or hide content at will, or, alternatively, could kill a person and destroy their soul if they saw no hope in the user. The book takes 80 hours to read, and not only has a corrupting effect on those around it, but prevents even plant life from growing. Bottom of the Iceberg. This is like the last level, but even players will likely not reach these depths. DMs only from here, I suspect. The Curse of Myth Nantar. Myth Nantar, originally the city of Carmanthor, was once an important community of the Cormanthyr, which was one of the Tel Qasir elven empires. The city was considered a bastion that epitomised high culture, magic, knowledge and civilization. Physically, it had an imposing background with many towers. Those owned by magicians often given the illusion of very strange forms. The city itself was in the shape of a battle-axe head. During the Weeping War, the Army of Darkness defeated the armies of Mithranor and overran the city. The defenders caused many casualties, but the sheer numbers sent by the Army of Darkness were overwhelming. As a last-ditched effort to protect the city, Jarok Haladrian gathered surviving bards to his concert hall to try to cast a final protection spell to ward off the Army of Darkness. Right as the spell's crescendo was reached, Hastim the Gentle Rebuke, a powerful Yugoloth invader, entered the hall and began causing chaos. This interference caused the spell to backfire, and, as a result, everyone in the hall was petrified. The stone figures of the bards continue to produce the final note of their song to this day, and whilst individuals have tried to attack the figures to stop the scream-like note, going as far as to lop off their heads, they continue their song. Those who enter the hall have a chance of going mad. It is said the casters are still alive in their petrified form, though, if that is the case, they would themselves be completely mad at this point. Warcraft. This is another entry which I wasn't sure on, but rather than ask, I've made a few guesses. This could relate to the inspiration of D&D on games like Warcraft. It's clear D&D had a big impact on a lot of games in the fantasy genre, and there is no reason this would be an exception. However, whilst there are similarities of names, races, etc., I can't find any solid sources on direct parallels that aren't also prevalent in ancient mythology and older fantasy settings, for example, The Lord of the Rings, so I'm not fully sure this is the answer. There are also multiple Warcraft tabletop games, ranging from a game based in the Pandemic system, to games based on wargaming, and even resource management board games. I don't think it's any of these, but there is one called Warcraft the Role-Playing Game, originally Dungeons & Dragons Warcraft the Role-Playing Game, which is effectively a setting based on 3rd edition. I don't think this game would be a major interest to those who aren't interested in the Warcraft series, but for those that are, this game would offer players the opportunity to roleplay in an important setting to them, and, from reviews, it generally seems to do a good job of it. Female Treants. I don't know what this one is in reference to at all. I'm worried that it's to do with people producing not suitable for work OC of female treants, and I want no part in that, nor do I want it in my browser history. The only notable fact I could find is that black squirrels feed on the shoots of female treants, which prevents population from getting out of control. If this entry is referring to that, it's certainly a niche tidbit of D&D lore to be aware of, but not, I suspect, the true purpose of this entry. Moving on. Gold Box. Before the Infinity Engine, D&D games often use the Gold Box engine. These games I'm far less familiar with, and I won't butcher them by trying to explain their content in too much detail, but they were the sort of game to appear on the Amiga and other consoles of that era. From what I can tell, they look graphically similar to games like King's Quest, but are top-down with more traditional RPG mechanics. The games seem largely to be based in the Forgotten Realms, though again, I don't want to speak too definitively on these games. They use the AD&D system. To list a few examples of games, there's Spelljammer, Pirates of the Realmspace, Forgotten Realms and Limited Adventures, the Pool of Radiance series, and even a Buck Rogers series based on the engine. GIF came from G.R.R. Martin. In the dead of night, Gary Gygax snuck into the home of the then unknown and unpublished G.R.R. Martin during a particularly heavy sleep. Gary looked through George's notebooks until he came across a name to steal. Githyanki. That story is, of course, a complete fabrication. What really happened is that in 1977, George had his first novel published, Dying of the Light, which included a race called the Githyanki. Charles Stross, another author, read the story and included the race name in his homebrew D&D campaign, which was later published in White Dwarf. The lore of this race was eventually incorporated into the game, particularly into Planescape. Unintentional plagiarism? Perhaps, but the races only share a name, not characteristic, and George seems unfazed, so I doubt we'll see any more lawsuits anytime soon. At least not over the Gith. Palace of the Silver Princess. What's so special about this module? It's one aimed at lower level characters, and whilst a good module for starter DMs and enjoyable all around, why do copies sell for thousands of pounds? Well, the version you have probably won't. The original run of this module was published with 2 main pictures that caused issues, which led to a recall and the destruction of thousands of copies. First, there was a drawn scene depicting a woman having her clothes torn off by beasts. In the context of the module, the scene was an allusion to encourage paladins to throw caution to the wind and YOLO into a trap. The image was described as S&M by management when they pulled the authors up in the meeting after the release. Second, and probably the real reason, considering the scene wasn't far from other published content, was that an illustrator had changed Gene Wells' three-headed giant, or Ubu, into a three-headed parody where the heads were each a caricature of staff-stroke management at TSR. There is no clear agreement on who it represents, nor do I think management knew either. However, the general impression of defiance led them to take action and recall the module. There was a second printing of the module with offending content removed. The original was orange, and new version green, but as you can probably imagine, the first edition has become a rare collector's item. Elminster told Ed about FR. Remember earlier when we talked about crystal spheres and how every possible reality is encapsulated in a crystal sphere that can, in principle, be accessed with a Spelljammer? Well, with that in mind, let's not forget that our reality is a possible reality. The Forgotten Realms, as a setting, is so deep and consistent, it really does seem to be fully fleshed out to a suspiciously high degree. There is a theory that Elminster travels to our reality and tells Ed Greenwood about the Forgotten Realms, which is why we have such a consistent, rich lore to refer to. I won't say much more for now, but I promise you that this entry of the Iceberg will go deeper. O. The good old Infinity engine again, giving us classics like Planescape Torment. In this entry, we have the character O, a minor character from the game and living embodiment of the letter O in the Divine Alphabet. He appears to be humanoid, though does not breathe, and his body does not match his movements. He appears differently to different people, though all sense something much larger when looking at him. O also appears in the non-D&D game Tides of Numenera. I wonder if he spelljammed. Or maybe the Divine Alphabet spans all crystal spheres as part of the Luminous Being. Perhaps O is nothing more than a part of the illegible scrolls of our DM in that case. Esper Genesis. Published by Alligator Alley Entertainment, Esper Genesis is a sci-fi tabletop RPG based on the 5e system. I've never played Esther, but it looks really interesting. As a third-party game, it seems to come closest to D&D in space that I have seen, and by that, I mean classes and mechanics really seem to match vanilla 5e. However, the focus seems to be on additions as a supplement, for example, with ship combat. Spelljammer is apparently coming to 5e though, so maybe this won't last forever. Looking online, I've seen the term space opera thrown around to describe the feel of Esper, so whilst I haven't played it yet, it seems to offer a true D&D 5e experience, whilst also having a Star Wars vibe, which sounds like every nerd's dream. I'm sure I won't be disappointed. It's not like nerds have ever been let down by hype. Beneath the Iceberg. Even my DM hasn't heard of these ones. Stage musical. I'm not 100% sure what this entry refers to, and I'm starting to prefer playing the guessing game rather than asking M. Christopher directly. He's always helpful, but there's an element of interpretation I can play with by inserting my own, clearly incorrect, theories. Though I am sorry for warping your creation, M. Christopher. At D&D Celebration 2021, there was supposedly the first officially endorsed D&D musical called The Circus of Sound, which ran for 2 hours to close out the day's events. This feels like it isn't what is being referred to though, to me at least, as it was one-off, and stage musicals, in my view, are characterised by having repeat performances over a period of time. A one-off musical feels more like a day activity for an audience, rather than something distinct. Here Be Dragons, on the other hand, is a stage musical running in New York, as I wrote the script for this specific entry. 28th of June 2022 is when I wrote this. It's now the 17th of August, so quite some time ago. This musical tells the story of a group of players finishing college and who, through their games of D&D, explore their thoughts and feelings towards the upcoming changes and their future prospects. The issue here is that the announcement for this musical seems to come after M. Christopher's Iceberg, so I don't know if it's exactly what's being referred to. She Kills Monsters is a stage play about a woman who copes with stress in her life by creating a D&D module. However, this is almost certainly not what is being referred to as a drama, stroke comedy, and not a musical. There are mentions online of other unofficial stage musicals, but I can't find anything concrete, so this entry will remain an ambiguous one with a scattered approach. Anything which sticks to the proverbial wall. Belothamog's true purpose. Thinking back to Elminster's alleged spelljamming antics, wherein Ed Greenwood is nothing but a journalist or historian, Why is it that we aren't overrun by demons, devils and monsters looking to do the same thing? There needs to be an in-lore explanation. Bolothamog is an alternative name for the Lovecraftian eldritch horror Yog-Sothoth, and is decried as the darkness between the stars. It is Yog-Sothoth that is the guardian force or entity that exists to ensure that nothing in the multiverse can escape to taint the true reality of the outer dimensions. When discussing this one with M. Christopher, and I admit that last description came directly from him, he very much enjoyed the fact that an eldritch horror is effectively the watchdog against fantasy creatures invading our world, though this does fit in with our earlier understanding of eldritch evil not fully mapping onto moral evil. Although, it is worth noting that if the Bolothamog interpretation is the case, and if the Elminster theory is true, how does Elminster do it? Does his power surpass them? Is his energy more ancient than theirs? I might be chatting nonsense at this point, but if Elminster ever pops into your head, please don't try to contemplate his nature too deeply. As Lovecraft would probably say, his nature could be so ancient and ineffable that it goes beyond all comprehension to the point of madness. Elminster could haunt your dreams, and perhaps he already haunts Ed's. Ben-Sozia. Having only appeared in 1E, Ben-Sozia is a relatively niche piece of lore. She was an archdevil queen of hell and consort to Asmodeus. She was murdered by the archdevil, Levistus, which was the reason for his imprisonment. Either because he tried to force himself on her, or because he attempted to sway her loyalties to him and failed. Ben-Sozia was the mother of Glacia, who is featured more prominently in lore as recently as 4E as the daughter of Asmodeus. There is an alternative version of Ben-Sozia's death, told in Dungeon Magazine 197, where Ben-Sozia actually was undermining Asmodeus and providing information to Levistus as his consort. But Levistus also took Glacia, her daughter, as his consort to gain even more advantage over Asmodeus. However, upon discovering the two timing, Glacia killed her mother, and the event was covered up and blamed on Levistus to protect Asmodeus' authority. This version confuses me slightly, as it doesn't make a lot of sense that Asmodeus would hold her in relatively good favour if she had been consorting with an enemy. So the faithful version of Ben-Sozia is, I think, likely the accurate story. Strike VHS. Strike is a TSR board game released in 1993. The game has a simplified version of D&D mechanics and included maps, miniatures and quests, which made it a good starting point for young or new players. The key to this section though is the accompanying videotape. The VHS is, simply, a guide for gameplay, given for a live action story with heavy use of special effects. However, for some, it is much more than that. Don Jolly, who has no association with Trigger Happy TV, wrote a blog post about the video, which I think really brings a certain magic to this tape for his long obsession. He points to the weirdness of the video as a contributing factor to his obsession, with multiple questions which could not be answered. Why so much world building in a tutorial video? Why show multiple shots of decapitations in a child-friendly board game iteration of D&D? Why is there a monitor in the video, but not in the game itself? Why are the rules so fast and loose in a tutorial for the game? Don eventually reached out to the video creator, Flint Dial, and had answers to some of the questions. For example, the monitor was planned, but omitted due to time restraints. The rules were wonky, because he was using an earlier version when creating it, etc. But excitingly for Don, there was also a planned sequel in outer space, which even had its own trailer. That, I think, also explains much of the effort in the creation of the VHS, and there were apparently plans for a full series at some point. The darkest of depths. Some say that at this level, fact and fiction are unverifiable. M. Christopher has transcended beyond simply having knowledge and become the creator of truth itself. Has he comprehended the eldritch truths of Elminster? Wild Space series. What do you know? The next entry in this Iceberg is about a D&D series set in outer space. Could it be? Yes. The niche Strike VHS and planned sequel in space, Wild Space, is the next entry of the Iceberg. I always enjoy Iceberg content where a different layer looks at a familiar topic even more deeply. The Wild Space series was both a sequel to the Strike VHS, as well as a sequel to the Spelljammer setting. The trailer, available on the internet and linked in the description below, shows the same over-the-top campy fun with the same special effects as before. There was a planned board game to go with it, which never released, and 4 novels, of which 1 was published, making it the only Wild Space content to officially release. It was called A Wild Ride and was an Endless Quest gamebook. That in itself is interesting, just to know what could have been and the plans around it, But even further, Wildspace was apparently mostly finished. Don Jolly, after meeting Flint Dial, ended up asking about the sequel, and Dial confirmed that Wildspace made it to post-production, but due to delays, by the time it was nearing completion, people had already moved on to other projects. He describes his last experience of the project as leaving an LA storage room which contained the materials and not seeing any of it since. Those of you interested in lost media may well be salivating, as there could be an entire sequel to the Strike VHS, set in space, sitting out there somewhere in an LA storage room, waiting to be found. Or, perhaps, it's been destroyed to make space for Friends reruns, or just LA apartments. Only time will tell. Original human creator. This entry is self-explanatory. In D&D lore, who is the original human creator? Dwarves are associated with Modron, elves with Corellian, but humans seem to have no specific god associated with them. Is that due to a primacy afforded to humanity? The others somehow being simulacrum races, rather than the original or authentic? Or is it a practical response to avoiding real-world controversy? Lord knows there's been enough. This entry is very specific, and I quote M. Christopher quite heavily, so I again don't want to claim the rest of this entry is from my own research. One answer to the question of an original human creator god in lore is Zarus, who states that a human's worst sin is to produce offspring with a non-human race. He's lawful evil and seemingly racist. Though I say that specifically in the context of D&D, as entities like elves, orcs and dwarves in D&D are not at all comparable to different races of human. I don't want to draw false equivalencies. M. Christopher explained to me a different and much more niche answer though, cobbling together evidence from Dungeon 100, Polyhedron 159 and Dragon 309. Essentially, within Gith lore, it suggests Gith were originally humans that were enslaved by Illithids, then were warped and mutated over time into the yellow creatures they are now. The Illithids themselves in this answer killed the original human creator goddess, Tarrasque, who was used in the campaign setting. M. Christopher justified this explanation being applicable to general lore with the fact that Gith are setting neutral and can appear anywhere, and Illithids are known to mess with timelines, so it isn't too far-fetched that Illithids killed the human creator god and turned a portion of humanity into Gith. M. Christopher added that it's even possible that the massive petrified dead corpse, known as the One in the Void, upon which Tinaraf was built, is the original dead human goddess, although that corpse has 6 arms, so only if the god did not create humanity in their image, which is itself very possible. It's an interesting take and a great final entry to this iceberg. Thanks for watching and don't forget to subscribe. Bye for now.